The frail alien woman was forcibly given to a human. Years later, they couldn't believe what they saw. Lyra had always known she was weaker than most. The Vether people, her people, were not made for battle or harsh survival like the other species in the galaxy. Her skin was thin and fragile, her body delicate, and her strength, if it existed at all, was hidden deep inside her. The Arathith Empire, with its cruel, war-hungry soldiers, had taken advantage of her people's weakness for generations, using them as slaves to carry out their brutal demands. For years, Lyra had been little more than a tool to the Arathith, a pawn in their endless war against every other species. She had never known peace. The few memories she had of her family were those of hiding, of being moved from place to place, never settling in one spot for too long. Her health had suffered, and she knew deep in her heart that her life was not meant to last long. But that changed when the Arathith decided to make a deal with the humans. It was a trade, one that they believed would secure more power for the Empire. They had no interest in human life, dismissing them as nothing more than ants on the edge of the galaxy. But they had heard whispers that humans were different, that they could be useful in ways they had yet to fully understand. And so, the Arathith, in their arrogance, demanded a trade, the Vether slaves for human goods. Lyra was among those chosen for the exchange. She had barely been able to understand what was happening when the decision was made. The Arathith soldiers came for her in the middle of the night, dragging her from the cell where she had spent the last few years. She was too weak to resist, too sick to fight back. They shackled her arms and forced her aboard the ship that would take her to the humans. The ship was dark, and the air was thick with the stench of metal and sweat. Lyra felt small in the cold, vast space. She had always been small, but now she felt even more fragile. Her body was burning with fever, her muscles aching with every movement, and she could barely stay conscious. She barely heard the voices of the Arathith soldiers around her. All she could focus on was the emptiness that seemed to swallow her whole. Hours passed, maybe days, before the ship finally landed. The planet was quiet, different from the harsh, industrial world she had left behind. Lyra felt a shiver run through her as the door of the ship opened, and she was pulled out into the light of a new world. The humans stood before her, not many, but enough to make her feel their eyes on her. They were all different, much taller than she was, their skin a variety of colors, their eyes filled with curiosity and pity. But one man stood out from the rest. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious face. He looked at Lyra as though he saw something more than just a frail alien woman standing before him. "Is this the one?" the man asked, his voice rough but calm. One of the Arathith soldiers nodded, grinning as if the deal had been completed. "Yes, she's one of the Vether, weak, frail, and barely alive. She'll make a perfect slave." The man didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Lyra, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was something about his gaze that was different from the other humans, something that didn't make her feel like an object. Lyra had heard stories about humans. Some said they were cruel and heartless, like the Arathith, while others claimed they were peaceful, strange creatures who valued life in a way the other species couldn't understand. But none of that mattered to her. She was tired, broken, and she had no reason to believe in anything anymore. Without a word, the man stepped forward and placed a hand on her arm, gentle but firm. Lyra flinched, pulling away slightly, but he didn't try to force her to stay. Instead, he simply looked at her with something that might have been pity, or perhaps it was compassion. It was hard for Lyra to tell. "You're coming with me," the man said, his voice steady. "I don't know what this is all about, but you're not going back with them." Lyra didn't understand. She could barely understand what had happened. Was he rescuing her? Was he saving her? Or was he just another human who would use her like the Arathith? Her vision blurred with exhaustion, and she sank to her knees, too weak to stand any longer. The man knelt beside her, his hand still on her arm. "I'll take care of you," he said quietly. "I won't let them hurt you." For a moment, Lyra thought she had heard him wrong. His words were simple, but they carried a weight she had never known. It was a promise, a vow, and it was enough to pull her from the brink of unconsciousness. She stared up at him, her mind barely able to process what was happening. For the first time in years, she felt something like hope, something she had long forgotten. Without another word, the man helped her to her feet and led her away from the Arathith soldiers. As they walked through the dusty streets of the human colony, Lyra couldn't help but feel a strange sense of wonder. This place was so different from the cold, metallic ships she had known. The air was fresh, the sun warm on her skin, and the people around them, though curious, didn't seem to look at her as though she were a thing to be used. Lyra didn't know how to feel. She had been given to this human, and she had no choice but to follow him. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was a piece of property. She didn't feel like an object. She felt seen. The man took her to a small, humble home, far from the busy part of the colony. It was a simple building, with a small garden outside and a few animals grazing in the field beyond. There was nothing extravagant about it, nothing that would have marked it as special to anyone else. But to Lyra, it was a world apart from everything she had known. The man didn't speak much as he guided her inside. He seemed to sense her exhaustion, and all he did was show her to a small bed in one corner of the room. He told her to rest, to sleep, and that he would be nearby if she needed anything. He didn't ask for anything in return, just gave her a place to lie down and rest. As Lyra lay there, her body aching, her mind racing, she realized something. She didn't know this man. She didn't know what he wanted or why he had helped her, but she knew one thing for certain. He was different. He wasn't like the others. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a chance at something better. The days that followed were like nothing Lyra had ever experienced. She woke to sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth of it unlike anything she had ever known. For years, she had lived in the shadows, in cold, dark places where the sun was a distant memory. But now she found herself in a place that felt different. The air was fresh, and the smells of the earth, the scent of flowers, of grass, of life, were strange but comforting. It was as though she had entered a world that was waiting for her, one where she could finally breathe. At first, she didn't know what to do. The human who had taken her in, Jonas, was kind but distant. He never asked her questions, never pushed her to speak or to explain herself. He simply made sure she had food, water, and rest. He showed her how to wash, how to care for herself, and slowly she began to feel a little less weak. Her body, once frail and trembling, was starting to recover. The aches that had constantly plagued her began to fade, replaced by a strange energy she hadn't known she had. But even more surprising to her was how she began to feel safe. It had been so long since she had felt safe, since she had been allowed to rest without fear of someone taking it away. Lyra was still wary, still unsure. She didn't trust easily, not after everything the Eradith had done to her people. She couldn't help but wonder why Jonas had helped her. What did he want in return? Why would he risk everything to protect someone like her? Was he really different from the others, or was this just another form of manipulation? But as the days passed, she saw that Jonas wasn't like the others. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't try to force her into anything. There was no cruelty in his actions, no hidden agenda. He simply did what he could to help, to make her comfortable. One afternoon, Jonas showed her how to tend to the small garden outside the house. He handed her a trowel and pointed to the rows of vegetables, showing her how to carefully dig the soil, plant seeds, and water the plants. Lyra had never seen a garden before. The only thing she had known about growing food was from the cold, sterile places where she had been kept. But here, everything was different. It was hard at first. Her hands were still weak, and her muscles were not as strong as they should have been. But Jonas was patient. He showed her again and again, his voice gentle but firm, until she began to get the hang of it. There was something deeply satisfying about the work, seeing the tiny green sprouts poke their heads above the soil, feeling the earth beneath her fingers. It was as if she was part of something bigger, something that gave her a sense of purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra began to change. Her body grew stronger, her movements less shaky. She was still thin, still fragile in many ways, but there was a strength in her now that had not been there before. And it wasn't just physical strength. It was something inside her, something that had been dormant for so long, that was beginning to awaken. Jonas, for his part, kept his distance. He never pushed her, never asked her to talk about her past or the horrors she had endured. He seemed content to let her find her own way, to heal at her own pace. But every so often, when she would catch his eye, she would see something there. A look of understanding, perhaps, or maybe just quiet curiosity. There was one moment, late one evening, when Jonas sat across from her at the small table where they ate their meals. The room was dim, lit only by a few candles. Lyra had finished her meal, but Jonas hadn't yet touched his. He was looking at her, his eyes thoughtful. It was the first time she had ever seen him study her in such a way. "You're healing," he said, his voice soft. "I can see it." You're getting stronger every day. Lyra nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had never been good with words, especially not words that spoke of her condition or the changes she was going through. Her life had never been about recovery. It had always been about survival. I'm grateful, she said quietly, unsure if the words even made sense. Jonas smiled at that, but it was a small, sad smile. He didn't push her to say more. Instead, he simply nodded and began to eat his own meal. For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with respect for the space that needed to be filled in its own time. That night after they had finished eating, Jonas showed Lyra how to wash the dishes. It was a simple task, but for some reason it made Lyra feel useful. She was contributing to the household in a way she had never done before. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. The next day, Jonas asked her if she wanted to help him with some repairs on the small barn behind the house. The roof had leaked, and some of the walls had cracked over time. It was an odd request, but Lyra agreed. She had no real experience with repairs, but it was a chance to spend time with him, to feel like she was part of something. When they arrived at the barn, Jonas handed her a hammer and some nails, showing her how to patch up the roof. It was a slow process, and there were times when Lyra struggled with the weight of the hammer or the awkwardness of the task. But Jonas was patient, always there to guide her. She noticed how gentle he was with her, always careful not to overwhelm her, but always encouraging. As the day wore on, Lyra began to feel something strange in her chest. It was a warmth, a feeling she hadn't felt in so long. It was as though her heart was slowly waking up from a long sleep. And for the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could trust Jonas. Not completely, not yet, but enough to know that he was not like the others. Later that evening, as they sat outside the house watching the stars, Jonas turned to her and spoke again. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd see someone so strong." Lyra was surprised by his words. She had never considered herself strong, not before, not now. She had always been the fragile one, the weak one. But there was something in Jonas's voice that made her think he was right. "I'm not strong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just surviving." Jonas's eyes softened. "Surviving is the first step towards strength," he said. "It's all anyone can do, really, but you're more than that. You've come farther than you know." Lyra didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't feel strong. She didn't feel like she had come far. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a chance. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live. As the days passed, the bond between Jonas and Lyra grew. It was slow, quiet, but it was real. Lyra began to trust him more, to let her guard down little by little. And with each passing day, her strength, both physical and emotional, grew. But deep down, she still couldn't shake the fear that one day everything would change. That one day she would be taken from this place, this peaceful life, and be thrown back into the nightmare she had once known. The thought terrified her. And yet a small part of her hoped that maybe she could stay. That maybe she had found a place where she could finally heal. And that, she realized, was a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Lyra had never imagined that such a life was even possible. She had always been told that her kind, the Vether, were nothing more than fragile beings, destined to be slaves or to die young. But as she stood on the porch of Jonas's home one morning, the sun warming her skin, she realized that she was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The farm had become her new world, a world where she no longer had to fear the dark corners of the galaxy or the cold, calculating eyes of the Arathith soldiers. Here, there was light, both in the world around her and in the way Jonas treated her. The simple routine of daily life, the care she took in tending the garden and repairing the barn, the shared meals and quiet conversations at the end of the day, all made her feel something she had never known before: peace. But peace, as Lyra would come to understand, is often a fleeting thing. One afternoon, as they were working in the garden, Lyra felt it, the sharp, gnawing sensation that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, the way the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, the way the birds suddenly fell silent. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing to see. The sun was still high in the sky, the wind was still gentle, and yet something had changed. Jonas noticed her unease. "What is it?" he asked, pausing in his work. His tone was calm, but there was concern in his eyes. Lyra didn't answer at first. She didn't know how to explain the feeling inside her, the sense that something was coming. She had never been able to ignore her instincts, and they were screaming now. Something was wrong, something was close, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. I don't know, she said finally, her voice soft. I just feel like something is coming. Jonas frowned but didn't push her to explain. Instead, he dropped his gardening tools and stood scanning the horizon with a keen eye. We'll be ready, he said after a long pause. If something's coming, we'll handle it. Lyra wasn't so sure. She had seen what the galaxy was like outside of this small farm. She had seen the cruelty, the violence, the way the strong trampled over the weak. She had felt the weight of that cruelty firsthand. And she knew that whatever was coming wouldn't be something they could easily handle. Not if it was what she thought it was. That night, as they sat together for dinner, Lyra's fears grew. The sky outside had darkened, and the stars twinkled eerily above them. Jonas was unusually quiet, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He kept glancing toward the door, his hand always near the rifle that hung on the wall. Do you think they'll come for me? Lyra asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Jonas looked at her, his eyes full of understanding, though he didn't answer immediately. She could see the hesitation in his face, the worry that he didn't want to admit. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I don't know, he said, his words slow, careful. I hope not. I've been trying to keep us under the radar, but there's only so much I can do. The galaxy doesn't forget things easily. Lyra looked down at her hands. She had never truly allowed herself to think about what would happen if the Erath found her. She had spent so many years hiding, running from one place to the next, that she had never thought about a future. And now, with Jonas, she had allowed herself to dream of something more. She had allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future here in this quiet place with him. But deep down, she knew that such peace was fragile. It couldn't last forever. Not when the Erath Empire was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, her fears were realized. They were working outside when they heard it, an unmistakable sound, the roar of engines growing louder by the second. Lyra's heart stopped in her chest. She knew what it was before she even saw it, the unmistakable roar of an Erath warship. Jonas's face hardened as he looked up, scanning the sky. The ship was descending, its massive shadow stretching across the ground like a dark omen. He reached for his rifle, his movements quick and practiced, but there was no hiding the panic in his eyes. He had been preparing for this, but now that it was here, he could feel the weight of the danger more than ever. They've found us, he muttered under his breath, turning to Lyra. You need to go inside, now. Lyra didn't move. She couldn't move. She had spent so long running from the Erath, but now, standing here in the open, the weight of the situation hit her full force. She wasn't just a helpless slave anymore. She wasn't the frail, alien woman who had been given away like an object. She was something more now, something stronger, and she wasn't going to hide anymore. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady, though the fear in her chest threatened to take over. I'm staying with you. Jonas hesitated. He could see the determination in her eyes, the same strength that had been growing in her since the day she arrived. He knew deep down that she wasn't the same woman who had been brought to him all those months ago. She had changed just as he had. But still, he couldn't let her face this alone. You don't know what they'll do to you, he said quietly, his voice filled with concern. You don't know what they'll do to both of us. Lyra's gaze softened, but her resolve remained. I know what they'll do if we let them, and I'm not letting them take me away again, not this time. Jonas looked at her, his heart torn between fear for her safety and the pride he felt in her strength. He could see how much she had changed, how much she had grown, and he realized something. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. They were in this together now as equals. All right, he said, his voice firm, though his eyes betrayed the worry in them. But we'll have to move fast. We need to get to the weapons cache and prepare. I'll make sure you're safe. Lyra nodded. She was ready. She had come so far, and now she would face this threat head-on. The Erath warship landed with a thunderous roar, its engines shutting off as the massive craft touched down. The doors to the ship opened, and out came the soldiers, men and women clad in dark armor, their weapons at the ready. Lyra could see the markings on their uniforms. These weren't the regular soldiers who had taken her all those months ago. These were the elite, the ones who had been sent to hunt down anyone who dared to resist the Empire. Jonas didn't waste time. He grabbed her hand and led her to the barn where they had stored their weapons. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for what was coming. Lyra's heart raced, but she didn't feel fear. She felt something else, something stronger. She was no longer the helpless woman she had once been. She had power now, power she had only begun to understand. Jonas handed her a weapon, something simple but enough to defend herself, and they moved to the edge of the field where they could see the soldiers advancing. Lyra took a deep breath and looked at Jonas, her eyes full of determination. "We're ready," she said quietly. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was ready, too. They were in this together, and no matter what the Erath threw at them, they would fight to protect what they had built. As the first wave of soldiers approached, Lyra stepped forward, her body glowing faintly with an energy she hadn't yet fully understood. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. And for the first time in her life, she felt powerful. The battlefield was silent for a moment as both sides measured each other. The Erath soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their heavy boots crushing the dirt beneath them. They were organized, disciplined, and ruthless. They had been trained for this, for combat, for conquest. And now they were here for Lyra. Jonas and Lyra stood side by side, their backs to the barn as they watched the enemy approach. Jonas's hand gripped the rifle tightly, his eyes focused on the soldiers in front of him. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the realization that their small farm, their quiet life, was now under siege. But there was something in Lyra's presence that made him feel more than just fear. He felt a strange sense of resolve, a strength that he hadn't known he was capable of. Lyra, for her part, stood still, her body tense but steady. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear that had once gripped her heart, the fear of being torn from the only place that had ever felt like home, was gone. In its place was something more powerful, something that had been buried deep inside her for years. The strength of the Vether, the power that had been hidden from her for so long. She didn't understand it fully yet, but she knew one thing: she was ready to fight. As the first soldier stepped forward, Jonas raised his rifle, aiming carefully at the advancing line. But before he could fire, Lyra moved. It was a blur of motion, faster than Jonas could follow. In the blink of an eye, Lyra was in front of him, her body glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. She raised her hand, and a wave of energy shot out, slamming into the first soldier with the force of a hammer. The soldier was thrown backward, his armor cracking under the impact. The other soldiers froze, their eyes wide with shock. They had expected a fight, but they had not expected this. They had not expected Lyra to possess such power, but there was no time for them to process it. Lyra moved again, faster this time, her body a blur of energy and strength. She reached the next soldier before he could react, her hand outstretched as she pushed him away with a surge of energy. He flew through the air, crashing into a nearby tree with a sickening thud. The other soldiers began to raise their weapons, their confusion turning into determination. They had been trained to handle threats like this. They had been trained to kill, but they hadn't been trained for Lyra. She stepped forward again, her eyes glowing with the intensity of her power. As she moved, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The air around her crackled with energy. The Erath soldiers fired their weapons, but their shots couldn't keep up with her. She was too fast, too powerful. Jonas, standing behind her, watched in awe. He had seen Lyra struggle to move when she first arrived, barely able to lift her head. And now she was unstoppable. The woman who had once been nothing more than a fragile slave was now a force of nature. And he wasn't about to stand on the sidelines. He raised his rifle, firing at the soldiers who were now scrambling to regroup. The battle raged on, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Lyra was everywhere, a whirlwind of energy and power. She took down soldier after soldier, her movements graceful yet deadly. Her energy seemed to grow with each passing moment, each victory. The Erath soldiers were beginning to realize the truth. They were outmatched. Jonas was by her side now, his rifle steady in his hands as he covered her movements. He wasn't as fast as Lyra, but he was just as determined. He fired when he saw an opening, taking down soldiers who had managed to get too close. But it was clear to him now, this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about something much bigger. It was about freedom. For him, for Lyra, and for everyone who had been oppressed by the Erath. Lyra moved through the battlefield with a calmness that astonished Jonas. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Every strike she made was calculated, every move purposeful. She had become something more than just a victim. She had become a warrior. The last of the soldiers, realizing they were losing, began to retreat. But it was too late. Lyra wasn't about to let them escape. With a final surge of energy, she pushed forward, her hand raised high. A wave of light shot out from her, striking the remaining soldiers and sending them crashing to the ground. The battlefield fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of heavy breathing and the distant crackling of fire. The Arathith soldiers lay scattered across the field, unconscious or worse. The battle was over and they had won. Lyra stood still, her chest heaving with exertion, her body still glowing faintly from the energy she had expended. She felt the power inside her slowly ebbing, but there was no fear now. She had won. They had won. Jonas slowly lowered his rifle, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the fight. He looked at Lyra, his eyes filled with admiration. "You did it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel like celebrating. There was no joy in battle, no happiness in killing. But there was something else, a sense of pride, of accomplishment. She had fought for herself, for her future, and for the future of those who couldn't fight. It was the first time in her life that she had felt in control. The sound of approaching footsteps brought both of their attention back to the present. Jonas raised his rifle again, ready to defend against any new threats. But when he saw who was approaching, he lowered the weapon. A group of humans from the nearby colony had arrived, their faces full of shock and awe at the sight before them. They had heard the battle, but they hadn't known what to expect. What they saw now was beyond anything they could have imagined. Lyra, the frail alien woman who had been given to Jonas, stood victorious in the middle of the field, surrounded by the fallen soldiers of the Arathith Empire. One of the men, an older figure with graying hair and a deep scar across his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes were wide as he took in the scene. "What in the name of the stars just happened here?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Jonas gave a small, exhausted smile. "Lyra happened," he said simply. "She's not the woman they thought she was." Lyra turned to face the man, her expression still calm but filled with an unspoken strength. "I'm not their prisoner anymore," she said quietly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the crowd around them. "And neither are you." The older man blinked, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand the words she had spoken. But all he could see was the woman standing before him, a woman who had changed the course of history. The Vether were no longer weak. They were no longer slaves. And Lyra was their symbol. Jonas stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support and pride. "This is only the beginning," he said softly, his voice filled with determination. Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with a feeling she had never known before. "I know," she said, her voice steady, "but for the first time I feel like I have a choice." The humans around them murmured, exchanging glances, but no one spoke. They didn't need to. They understood now. They had seen the truth. Lyra had risen. And she wasn't going back. The silence that followed the battle was unlike anything Jonas had ever experienced. The once bustling farm was now eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle wind rustling through the trees. The ground was littered with the fallen soldiers of the Arathith Empire, their dark armor glinting in the fading light. The air smelled of smoke, the remnants of explosions still rising from the field. It had been a victory, but there was no joy in it, no celebration. There was only the aftermath, the realization that their fight wasn't over. Lyra stood at the center of the battlefield, her body still glowing faintly with the energy that had surged through her during the fight. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, her skin damp with sweat. She felt exhausted but not broken. There was a strength within her now, something that had awakened over the past months, something that she could no longer deny. She turned to Jonas, who was standing just behind her, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His expression was one of quiet pride, but also of concern. He had seen her fight, had watched her take down the Arathith soldiers with the power of the Vether coursing through her. But now, in the aftermath, he could see the toll it had taken on her. She had fought for her freedom, but the cost had been high. "Are you all right?" Jonas asked, his voice low as he approached her. Lyra nodded, though the fatigue in her eyes betrayed her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady but tired. "I just need a moment." Jonas studied her for a moment, then nodded. He could see the same weariness in her that he felt in himself. The battle had been fierce, and while they had won, it had come at a cost. They had taken down the Arathith soldiers, but they knew that this was just the beginning. The Empire wouldn't let this go. They would come back. They always did. "We can't stay here," Jonas said after a long pause, his tone serious. The Erathith will send more. They'll want to reclaim what they've lost. Lyra looked around at the remains of the battlefield, the scattered bodies of the soldiers she had defeated. The thought of fighting again, of facing more Erathith soldiers, was a daunting one, but she knew Jonas was right. They couldn't stay. Not if they wanted to keep what they had fought for their freedom. We'll leave, she said, her voice filled with determination. We'll find somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach us. Jonas nodded. We'll gather what we can from the farm, get the horses, and head out at dawn. They spent the next few hours preparing for their departure, gathering supplies and packing everything they could carry. It was a bittersweet task, leaving the place that had become their home, the place where they had found peace and comfort. But there was no other choice. They had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of the Erathith. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, they finished their preparations. The horses were packed with everything they could carry, and the small farmhouse stood silent behind them, its door left open. Jonas took one last look at the place that had been their sanctuary before turning to Lyra. We're ready, he said quietly. Lyra nodded, her heart heavy. She knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. They were leaving everything behind, but they were also taking something with them, something that the Erathith could never take away. They were taking their strength, their courage, and their will to fight. Together they rode through the night, their path lit only by the stars overhead. The horses moved steadily, their hooves tapping softly against the ground. The night was peaceful, almost too peaceful considering the chaos that had just unfolded. But Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The Erathith wouldn't let this go. They would hunt them down, and they would stop at nothing to reclaim what they had lost. The journey was long, and the days blurred together as they traveled through forests, across rivers, and over hills. They kept moving, always looking over their shoulders, always alert. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Every time they stopped, every time they took a moment to rest, Lyra felt the weight of what they were up against. She felt the eyes of the Empire on her, always watching, always waiting. But with each passing day, Lyra grew stronger. The power that had awakened within her during the battle against the Erathith continued to grow. She didn't fully understand it, but she knew it was there. It was a part of her now. She could feel the energy coursing through her, the strength of her people, the Vether, surging in her veins. She was no longer the fragile, sickly woman who had been handed over to Jonas all those months ago. She was something more, and the galaxy would soon know it. Jonas noticed the change in her, too. He saw the way she carried herself now, more confidently, more purposefully. She was no longer afraid to step into the unknown. She had found her place in the world, and nothing would take it from her. He had always believed in her, but now, seeing her like this, he realized just how much she had changed. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lyra looked at Jonas, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what will happen when we're ready?" she asked, her voice soft. Jonas glanced at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "When we're ready to fight back," she said. "When we finally take the fight to the Erathith." Jonas was silent for a moment, his thoughts far away. "I think about it every day," he said finally. "But we're not there yet. We need to gather support, allies. We can't take on the Empire alone." Lyra nodded, her eyes distant. "We'll need to unite others, won't we? Other species who have suffered under the Erathith's rule." Jonas nodded. "Yes, and that's not going to be easy. The Empire is powerful and they have a lot of resources, but if we can find others who want to fight, who want to stand against them, maybe we can turn the tide." Lyra looked down at the fire, the flames casting shadows across her face. "I've seen how the Empire treats people. I felt their cruelty. I won't rest until they're stopped. I won't stop fighting until we've won." Jonas met her gaze, his expression full of resolve. "I know, and I'll be there with you every step of the way." The fire crackled as the night deepened around them, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. But Lyra knew it wouldn't last. The Erathith would come. They always did. And when they did, she would be ready. They continued their journey, always moving forward, always looking ahead. The road was long and the dangers were many. But Lyra and Jonas had something that the Erathith could never take from them. Hope. Hope for a better future, hope for a life without fear, hope for freedom. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, but Lyra had learned one thing over the past months. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Jonas. She had her strength, and together they would fight. Together they would take back what had been stolen from them. And when the time came, when they were ready to stand against the Empire, They would show the galaxy what it meant to be free.